listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rod Davis, and this week it's just me. There was potential for having an interview episode this week, but I've had to juggle my schedule around for various reasons, so I've got a whole bunch of great interviews coming up in subsequent weeks. But I thought I'd take the opportunity this week to talk a little bit about philanthropy and artificial intelligence, or AI. It's something that I've worked on for quite a few years now. I think I first did some work on it back in about 2016 when I was still at Charities Aid Foundation and doing quite a lot of work on emerging tech and philanthropy. And I've had various sorts of ideas about it, that some of which people have found interesting and taken seriously, and some of which have probably been absolute nonsense. But it's certainly a subject that has become ever more relevant, and I think particularly since the end of last year and the start of this year, AI seems to be, a topic of conversation pretty much everywhere, on the front pages and on TV and radio and even, at middle-class dinner parties. I guess, why is that? Well, the obvious reason is the emergence of ChatGPT, which is the conversational interface developed by OpenAI based on their originally GPT-3 and now GPT-4 algorithm and large language model. And I think for the first time for a lot of people, this gave a sense of what artificial intelligence really is and what it could do, and has sparked all kinds of interest in harnessing the benefits, but also all kinds of moral panic and fear about what the impact is going to be on various different aspects of our life. I think as a result of that public awareness, and probably was already happening anyway, there's also, I think, a big race on to own the technology and also to control and regulate it. So I think companies are all kind of circling around wanting to be able to snatch a lead on their competitors when it comes to developing tools that harness some of the new capabilities of AI. And governments and regulators and others are thinking about how they invest in AI and develop their own AI policies so that they don't fall behind in a kind of global race. I think there's also, I guess, quite a lot of talk increasingly about the more science fiction-y sounding aspects of artificial intelligence and the potential for the development of genuine human-level general artificial intelligence, and whether this would be a good thing or whether, as lots of people think, it poses a sort of existential risk to humanity as we know it. I think in a more prosaic sense, there are also questions about whether automation, even at a level below general intelligence, would have a huge impact on our economies and on the nature of work, and what that would mean for the future of our societies, where so much of it is kind of predicated on the idea of us all being useful economic units. So I want to talk about a bit of that stuff, but I want to focus also specifically on what the relationship is between artificial intelligence and philanthropy, both in terms of how philanthropy might be able to harness AI, and also what role philanthropy needs to play perhaps in addressing some of the unintended consequences of AI. I think it's interesting to note, just as a historical curio that you might not be aware of, that there's a pretty strong philanthropic angle on the origins of AI as a concept, and certainly as a piece of terminology. In fact, the first recorded usage of the phrase artificial intelligence was in a grant application to the Rockefeller Foundation in, I believe, 1955, by a group of computer scientists, obviously sort of relatively early computer scientists, who were looking for funding for what became known as the Dartmouth Conference, which is a sort of legendary computer science conference in 1956, which led to the development of a lot of the kind of early thinking about artificial intelligence. And, that's interesting in itself. I think it also gives a sense that actually, philanthropy might have had a hand in one of the kind of the problems with AI as a concept and as a terminology, which is the phrase itself, artificial intelligence, is perhaps not always helpful when we're talking about this technology. When we're talking about the potential for general human level intelligence in a sort of speculative sense, yes, maybe artificial intelligence makes sense. But a lot of the time when we talk about AI or artificial intelligence as it is applied in the world at the moment, I think this gives a false sense often that what we are talking about is sort of human level general intelligence, or kind of the killer robots, or that sort of thing that we see on television and in films and read about in books, whereas actually a lot of it is, much more sort of prosaic. It's actually about, analysis of large data sets and developing algorithms that are able to spot patterns and offer predictions. And so actually there's, kind of, I think, some more specific terminology that is useful to flag up. I don't want to do a kind of AI 101. I'm not sure this is the best place to do it. And also I think there are plenty of places that you can find that out. But just in terms of specifying a few bits of terminology that I'll be using throughout the podcast, one is machine learning, or deep learning, which is a specific form of machine learning. The crucial point there is that when artificial intelligence first came about as a concept in the 1960s, the way in which you would try and achieve intelligence within a computer system was to program in directly the rules for what you wanted it to do. Now, the challenge always there is there are quite a lot of things that humans do which we would see as crucial parts of being intelligent or being human that we're very good at doing, but we're absolutely terrible at being able to specify rules for. And that includes things like image recognition, or being able to hold a conversational in sort of normal, natural language. And so actually the systems were very limited in terms of their ability to do this. The shift came with the idea that instead of trying to figure out all of the rules ahead of time and program them in the form of a specific algorithm, why not develop algorithms that themselves start off relatively simple, but are designed to be able, through a process of kind of trial and error and constant self-modification, to learn, in a sense, or to kind of get better at a specified task. And this is really, without going into too much detail, where a lot of the kind of amazing developments in the last decade or so in terms of things like image recognition and what they call natural language processing have come from. And then more recently, you may have heard about large language models, or LLMs. Well, this is just a specific terminology for the particular application of machine learning that leads to things like ChatGPT, which are language-based systems where they're trained on very, very large data sets of language, and then they develop through this process of iteration a model that allows them. Essentially what they're doing is not holding a conversation with you in the way that we would understand it. They are predicting what would be the best order of words that would meet the requirements of the task that has been set for them. And, there's a very deep question about whether or not they actually understand that in any meaningful sense, and what the distinction is between being able to use language in a way that's perfectly recognizable and understandable and actually understanding it, which anybody of a philosophical bent might have heard of John Searle's Chinese room argument, and it's essentially kind of a version of that, but that's going to take us down a rabbit hole and also get me back into my university level maths and philosophy days, where I'll very quickly prove that I can't really remember most of the detail of these things, so I think maybe let's skirt away from it. But that's a little bit of the terminology. I guess the other thing I just wanted to say before we dive into the actual detail on AI and philanthropy is, why is it that AI has accelerated so much over recent years, even before the development of ChatGPT? Well, one thing is, as I've kind of hinted at already, the development of new tools, so these new approaches like deep learning and forms of image recognition, natural language processing, development of large language models that have kind of accelerated the capabilities of the technology pretty significantly. Another factor has been a huge explosion in the availability of data. Now, data is the kind of raw material that makes particularly machine learning possible, because you have to have these vast data sets over which these algorithms can be trained, essentially, so that they can get good at whatever task it is that you want them to perform. And until, I guess, relatively recently, that was a huge limiting factor. There were probably only a few areas of life or industry where there were those kinds of data sets. But as a result of the internet and the rise of social media and other things, there are so many images being created, video, photo, there's so much audio data, there's so much language in the form of social media posts and online material, that all of a sudden data is not as much of a limiting factor in any case, in any sense as it once was. there are still some pretty big questions about the ownership of that data and what it means to train an algorithm on the basis of, data sets based on human endeavor, and kind of who actually is able to make money off those, which we might touch on towards the end in some of the sort of ethical issues. But the essential point is the data is now there. The other kind of quite pragmatic point is that even if all that data was there and you developed the algorithms, that really wouldn't work unless you were able to run them on something. And a huge increase in the degree of processing power has been a big factor as well, particularly the development of ever more powerful, what they call graphical processor units, or GPUs, which have been driven, quite a lot by the computer gaming industry, because there's a huge demand for these GPUs to make sort of large, powerful, visually intense games work. And they are actually very important increasingly now for AI, and particularly kind of machine learning systems. And then the final factor is money. As people have seen the potential in this stuff, and as some of it's become more of a reality, and it's clear that there is a market impact, money has piled into AI. Whether some of that is part of the classic technology hype cycle, and there's a bubble developing, that still remains to be seen. For my money, or my imaginary money, because I don't actually have any to invest in AI in any meaningful sense, there is some overhype, but it doesn't feel anything like, to me, the sort of hype that we saw in, for instance, cryptocurrency and blockchain, which is another area I used to do a lot of work in, where the hype never felt as if, it always felt as if it was out of kilter with the reality of what was being developed on the ground, particularly when it came to blockchain and cryptocurrency and philanthropy, where there really weren't that many use cases, and that was out of whack with what was being claimed for the technology. As we'll see in a moment, there's still a danger of overhype when it comes to the application of artificial intelligence to philanthropy. But on the other hand, there are an increasing number of real life tools harnessing AI, or even if that's not the right terminology, harnessing this kind of technology of machine learning to do really quite meaningful things that could have an impact, at least on the world of work. So, for all of those reasons, I think it's something we really need to be thinking about. So, in terms of thinking about the relevance to philanthropy, I like to split it into kind of three broad areas. So the first that I'm going to talk about first is about the direct application of philanthropy, of artificial intelligence, to finding new ways of addressing social and environmental problems or challenges. This is what often gets termed the sort of AI for good space. So I think the first thing to say here is this a real thing? Yes, it is, and I'll say a bit in a moment about some of the examples that I'm aware of that I think are really interesting. I think there is room for a note of caution, as with a lot of these things, that it's easy for it to get a little bit overblown, because I spend quite a lot of my time trying to look for examples of AI being applied in the non-profit or charity sphere, because I quite often get asked to talk about AI and philanthropy, and one of the first things naturally people say is, oh, could you give me an example of that? So I like to make sure that I've got some to hand. And I still struggle to some extent to find good ones, because I think there is still a relatively small number of case studies out there. Now, it may be that we're approaching a tipping point, and actually there's a vast number of organisations experimenting with this stuff, and it hasn't quite filtered out into the wider consciousness, or I don't know about it yet. So, it might be that all of a sudden this stuff will be ubiquitous. But I think there is a danger of kind of over-claiming for the scale of AI for good as it stands. I guess the other thing to say is it might be that we're looking in the wrong place, potentially, if what we're expecting is charities or sort of traditional non-profits to be engaging in AI projects or kind of developing their own use cases of AI. When in actual fact, as with a lot of other sort of tech for good applications, it tends often to be more startups or established tech companies that are doing this as part of their desire to show that they have a social purpose. That's interesting, and it goes to an interesting wider question about the increasing prevalence of corporations and for-profit companies putting social purpose front and center in what they do, or kind of claiming that the work they do has a social purpose. And tech companies, I think there's a particular danger that sometimes they present the work that they do commercially as if it is almost as important from a social good aspect, because they're so sort of messianically believe that they're improving the world through the provision of their widgets and apps and platforms, that it's also for the good of humanity and society, and so therefore it should be seen as kind of social purpose or philanthropic. I think there are dangers to blurring those lines. Not that I necessarily am entirely cynical about the idea that you can further social good through for-profit means, but I think you need to scrutinise those claims quite hard. I think the other thing is there's also a danger of what often gets called tech solutionism, which is essentially the problem that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And from the point of view of people coming from the tech industry, their worldview is obviously likely to be shaped by the fact that they have applied technology, effectively in their commercial background in order to sort of make money. And so they might see technology, they might both see kind of problems as technology problems, but also they're likely to see solutions as lying in technology as well. And, there's absolutely a huge amount of scope to apply technology more to address social and environmental problems. And as I said, I'll give a couple of examples in a moment. But there is a danger of solutions going in search of problems. And that is something that you do see time and time again when sort of people start out from the point of view of wanting to use a particular technology and sort of casting around for charitable use cases, rather than starting from, well, what is the problem, and then thinking about what the most appropriate way of addressing it is, which may involve little or no technology at all, and certainly might not involve artificial intelligence. But in terms of there being actual examples of AI for good that we should, kind of take seriously, there are some really interesting ones out there. So, as I say, at the moment they tend to be clustered around areas in where the size of the data sets is sufficiently large that you can kind of apply machine learning. And often they are developed in partnership with academic centres and also with the technology industry, because again, the skills and the know-how are not necessarily or very unlikely to be found within the non-profit sphere, and that's probably something that we will continue to see, that partnership is going to be a key part of harnessing this technology. But one area, for instance, is around medical research, particularly the use of medical imaging data, so sort of scans of things like eyes, for instance. So there's an interesting example where Moorfields Eye Hospital in the UK is part of a project where they've been applying machine learning to scans of people's eyes, and then using that to develop more effective pattern recognition and therefore sort of prediction mechanisms to try and spot the early onset signs of certain kind of degenerative eye conditions. And it's proven to be hugely effective, and this is something we've seen in quite a few other areas of medicine as well. There's also quite a lot going on in the field of conservation, where again there's quite a lot of data, because there's images coming in from photos and camera traps and video and that kind of thing. And so there are quite a few projects using remote camera trap data, for instance, and algorithms have been trained that are able to identify either images of animals or things like cryptic animal footprints and signs, and become much more effective at identifying those than humans are, and certainly doing it at a scale that's not possible. And what that's meant in a few cases is where there's sort of very large amounts of camera trap data and things coming in, the people involved in these projects, the scientists and those working for conservation organisations, have been able to get a much better sense of the actual scale of populations of sort of extremely rare animals that are sort of difficult to spot. And in some cases, that's given them a sense that actually those populations are more healthy than they might have otherwise thought. There's also more active applications. So there are things like I know the Lindbergh Foundation had a project a few years ago, and maybe still be going, with an AI company called Neurala, where they were applying AI to data that was coming in from video surveillance and drones, I think, in around one nature preserve in southern Africa, and they were then using that data to predict the movements of herds of elephants and also data on the movements of poachers, and were able to develop a prediction mechanism that sort of told them where there were particular areas of risk of poaching, and then they were able to kind of intervene earlier and move the elephants off to other areas to sort of prevent that happening. So I think that kind of thing is really interesting. And then another example that's been around recently that I think is really interesting, there's a project called Be My Eyes, which was already around as an app. And essentially what it did was offer to people with a visual impairment that they could sign up to use this app. And then initially what would happen is they would sort of log a task that they needed doing, so a document reading or something identifying that they weren't able to do because of their visual impairment. And that was then given out to visually able volunteers who were able to sort of do this as a kind of digital micro-volunteering thing. But a new version of Be My Eyes, or a new kind of app, has come out where they've automated some of that function using image recognition capabilities and actually ChatGPT. And so now there is a version where a visually impaired person can use this app, and they can talk to it essentially conversationally and ask it questions about their surrounding, which, using the image recognition functionality, the app is able to then answer and sort of tell them what's around them, or to be able to read documents and things, and it's entirely automated. So I think, in terms of accessibility possibilities, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, I think there's some really exciting things potentially going on. Okay, I think, that gives you a sense that AI for good may not be as big as it, sometimes is claimed to be, but it's a definite thing. In the next section, I want to go on and talk about what I think is probably the area in which most nonprofits will feel the impact more immediately. Because I think a lot of them will probably see AI for good as a relatively niche subset of wider sort of philanthropy and civil society, and possibly not that's something for them unless they're extremely kind of tech savvy early adopters. But the way in which I think more organizations will feel the impact is the impact that AI has on the wider operating environment in which charities and non-profits work, both themselves as organizations and the systems and structures that they work within. So stay tuned for that.
Yet the day is not far distant when the man who dies, leaving behind him millions of available wealth, which was free for him to administer during life, will pass away unwept, unhonored, and unsung. Man who dies thusly dies disgraced. Dies disgraced. Dies disgraced. Disgraced. Disgraced.
Okay, so in this section, I want to talk about the impact of artificial intelligence on non-profits themselves, as I say, both at the level of organizations, individual organizations, and then in terms of the wider operating environment within which they work. So in terms of that organizational level impact, I think this is where you start to encounter the kind of a lot of the excitement and to some extent the hype about the impact of ChatGPT. There's a lot being said at the moment about what does this mean for fundraisers, what does it mean for charities, how can grant makers use it? And this I think it's worth kind of unpicking what some of the potential possibilities are. So not all of these are reliant on ChatGPT. Some of these are different applications of machine learning, but they're all kind of tied into the capabilities of AI. So let's start, for instance, with a relatively basic one, which is the use of what's called optical character recognition for data capture. So this is basically AI technology that uses image recognition, which you can then point at a document and it will recognize the letters and the characters, as the name suggests, and then it can turn that into data, essentially. And so there are tools, that allow you to do this, to take a picture of a table or whatever, and then it will automatically, you can do this in Excel now, actually, it'll automatically turn it into data in a spreadsheet. Or similarly, you can do this, you could maybe have, like paper grant applications, and you could use your phone or another piece of technology to take a photo of that, and all of the information, instead of having to be manually entered by a human being, would just be automatically taken into your CRM or your grants database. And, potentially this is really exciting because a lot of that work is quite boring. I would think most people do it, don't necessarily enjoy doing it. And there's there's a lot of potential for human error and making mistakes. And this feels like one of those areas where automation, it might threaten some people's jobs, and that's a question we'll come back to in a moment. But it feels as though it might actually free up a lot of people's time not to do those sorts of tasks and instead focus on, more interesting, more rewarding, higher value work. Similarly, there are a whole range of, really kind of rapidly increasing range of efficiency tools that don't just automate those kind of data-intensive, repetitive tasks that we've been able to automate for quite a while, to be honest. They manage to automate tasks that up until recently we would have said were exactly the tasks that human beings were still required to do. And some of that is still fairly rote stuff that most people don't enjoy. So it's things like managing your calendar, or writing emails, or producing summaries of long reports. But also there are kind of creative tasks as well. So, there are now products, things like Dectopus, for instance, which is a AI-powered presentation generator where you can essentially get it to do slide decks for you. Or Durable, which is an AI-powered website builder, and it's really very quick. Or Looker, which is an AI-powered graphic design platform, so you can build logos and things like that. And also, there are other things like you can, if you need imagery nowadays, there are things like Dolly, which is another product of OpenAI, or Stable Diffusion and others, where you can generate art from text prompts. So essentially, if you want a picture of something, say you're like, I've done this particularly, if you want a picture of Andrew Carnegie as a Marvel supervillain, for instance, you just type that in and it produces really a very good image of Andrew Carnegie in the style of a Marvel supervillain, in case that's something that you felt you needed. But you can also, just say, if you're producing marketing copy or website content, for instance, you put in a picture, a photo of people standing around looking at a donation box or something like that. And instead of having to go and find that yourself on the internet or pay rights for it, which often you would through a sort of subscription service, you can just instantly get that image that you want to use. And similarly, you can produce written content, obviously using things like ChatGPT and other tools, and you can combine that image generation and text generation to produce social media posts or website content or marketing content. And even, in kind of more practical things like grant writing, there's a lot of people, I think, starting to experiment with using ChatGPT to write grants, or at least as the basis or as a starting point for writing grants. And on the flip side, using it for things like prospect research, so sort of finding places to go to look for funding, again, using ChatGPT almost as a sort of search engine there. So there are all kinds of ways in which what is called generative AI, it's probably a piece of terminology I should have clarified up front, which is artificial intelligence or AI that is able to create or generate writing or images or video or that kind of thing, ways in which that could potentially have a huge impact on lots of the different functions that exist within all kinds of organisations, including non-profits. There are some immediate challenges I think it's worth spelling out at this point. One is that ChatGPT is a hugely powerful tool, and I've certainly played with it myself, and many of you listening might have done, and it is deeply impressive. There is reason for quite a lot of caution because it produces material that, shall we say, is not always factually accurate, or what is technically often known as utter bullshit, because it doesn't understand in any meaningful sense, and it is a system designed to produce a text-based response that meets the requirements of the prompt that you've given it, and in the best possible way. And unfortunately, if this means doing things like making up references or even kind of claiming that things happened in the real world that didn't happen, it may well do that. And people are sort of finding this out to their cost. So there's a growing number of instances, examples, for instance, of lawyers who have clearly used ChatGPT to help them in preparing cases and to sort of find precedents and case law. And then they've gone and presented these cases, and somebody has pointed out that things that they're citing don't exist. They're just made up cases. So there's a real need to be very careful when taking some of this information that is produced at face value. I think there's also a kind of wider ethical issue as well, which I mentioned briefly earlier, which is, yes, it's amazing to be able to create some of these, AI-generated images or text, but we probably do need to be aware that the only reason that is possible is because they have harnessed very large data sets of human-created images and text from the internet as training data. And there is a real question about what that means in terms of ownership and intellectual property, and whether that's kind of an appropriate thing. I think there's also the challenge of kind of leaping headfirst into automation and seeing that as a way of replacing human beings, which is kind of the bad version of AI and work, which is the one that kind of gets raised as a potential scare story often. And I think it's important at this point to say, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There's definitely a choice there. The optimistic or utopian vision that a lot of people have is that actually what we will see increasingly is people getting to grips with these systems, and we will have humans and AI systems working together in harmony. And actually what we'll get as a result is the best of both. There's an interesting precedent for this from the world of chess, where obviously computer chess was developed in the 1980s. And then it sort of hit a real turning point when the chess computer Big Blue managed to beat Garry Kasparov, who was a world champion at the time and a chess grandmaster. And I think after that, there was a point at which the chess world became quite despondent, because they essentially sort of thought, well, have we reached a point where no human being will, in a few years' time, being able to beat one of these chess supercomputers? So what do we do? Do we let the computers play each other and watch that? Do we ban computers and let humans play humans, but in the knowledge that they're not as good as these other chess playing agents? Or do we allow humans and chess computers to work together and see what happens there? And this was really interesting, because what they developed was what was called centaur chess. So obviously kind of drawing on the classical mythological idea of the centaur, so the sort of half human, half horse creature. And this was the combination of human and chess computer. And what they found that was really interesting was that although the best chess computers increasingly would always beat the humans, actually the combination of human and computer would beat the best other computers. So there was something in that mixture of sort of human ingenuity, lateral thinking, creativity, and the sort of brute processing power of these computers that meant that the combination of them was more powerful than either working alone. And, the optimistic view is maybe that's what we'll find happen, and we'll get a version of, sort of centaur philanthropy, for instance, or what Beth Cantor and Alison Fine, who've written quite a lot about this sort of thing, have called co-botting. Unfortunately, that is the utopian view. The danger in the short term is that we are seeing exactly the bad version play out, and this is kind of front of mind at the moment, because there was an example that hit the headlines recently of a non-profit, the National Eating Disorders Association in the US, which is a kind of a paradigm example of how not to implement ChatGPT. So this organization basically, they ran an advice line for people with eating disorders, and they decided, because it should be said, because their human workers decided to unionize, so that's another element of this story that's pretty horrible. But because they decided to unionize, the non-profit decided that instead they would develop a ChatGPT based automated AI-driven version of their advice service and implement that. But a couple of days before it was due to go live, some of the people who had been testing it pointed out that actually this system had started giving out advice that was absolutely contrary to all of the kind of best practice on what the kind of advice you should give to people with eating disorders. And a lot of what it was telling people to do was actively harmful. And so they, the non-profit pulled the plug on their plan to implement it. But I think it goes to show that the dangers of kind of rushing to entirely replace human involvement in these systems. And when we're looking, I guess, in the non-profit world to implement things like ChatGPT, you need to do it very much with a sort of humans in the loop mindset, so that we're not kind of rushing to some of that naive automation. I think that just in terms of some of the other challenges that come with generative AI, another philanthropy and non-profit example that was pretty interesting a couple of months ago was that one of the branches, the country branches of Amnesty, I think it was Amnesty Sweden, I'll have to double check, but they put out a post about police brutality in Colombia, and they decided to use an image to go along with this for social media purposes. But it transpired that it was clear on the thing. It sort of said at the bottom, this image has been generated by AI, and this caused a huge furore. Now, I think the challenge here was that Amnesty had done it with the best of intentions. I think they wanted to do this because they felt it was inappropriate to have a picture of a real person being essentially kind of brutalized by the police. So instead, they would produce an AI-generated image that illustrated this same point. But I think a lot of people said that's really dangerous here because, the whole point for campaigning organizations and NGOs is about their authenticity when they're talking about some of these issues. And if people get a sense that actually they're kind of, using fake images or, what might be called deep fakes, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit, that is potentially really problematic because it undermines that authenticity and the trust people have in what they're saying. So I think that was a really kind of interesting example. And then if we sort of move beyond the impact on individual organizations, I guess the other place where we'll see quite a lot of impact of AI that's relevant to philanthropy is in the impact that it has on the wider operating environment. And this is something I don't think there's been a huge amount said about at the moment, but I think is an area that merits a lot more thought and exploration. And this is where the application of AI in things like the financial system or in regulation, that's already happening. Like lots of financial companies are starting to use algorithmic decision-making systems, for instance, to determine eligibility for financial products or for bank accounts. And similarly, regulators are experimenting with using AI to develop more kind of predictive mechanisms for regulation so that they can shift from kind of policing things after the event when they've gone wrong to kind of predicting where they will go wrong and intervening much earlier in the stage. And I think, we'll start to see some of that happen in the worlds that charities and non-profits work in as well. So I think that kind of impact on the wider operating environment is really important. But the one that I want to focus in on, because it's absolutely sort of front and centre relevant to philanthropy, is the impact in the wider operating environment in terms of how AI is going to affect how people give to charities and how they give philanthropically. And I think this is an area, again, where I've been banging on about it for a few years, but I feel as though there's a lot more that needs to be said about it. And I guess the reason that I think this is important is that we're increasingly kind of used to the idea of getting tailored, personalized recommendations in all sorts of other areas of our lives. So increasingly, we use Netflix and we get recommendations for what to watch, and Spotify tells us what to listen to, and YouTube, either tells us to watch children unboxing presents or invites us to watch ISIS recruitment videos. Because the algorithms, I think, don't always work, although that's a slight sort of tongue-in-cheek thing, because increasingly they really are quite accurate. But the point is we're getting increasingly used to those sorts of tailored recommendations that are provided by algorithms, what are called recommender algorithms. And I think we will come to expect that in lots of other areas of our lives, and the consumer expectation will extend to philanthropy and to giving. I think in a few years' time, people will think it's kind of weird when you come to make decisions about giving that you don't get the same sort of tailored recommendations. And, people will move to meet that demand. Particularly, I think this is tied into something else that we've talked about on the podcast before, which is the platformization of philanthropy, and increasingly the fact that a lot of giving is happening more and more through commercial platforms that are adding giving functionality to what they do rather than sort of traditional non-profit platforms. So you've got kind of commercial payment platforms and sort of cash payment platforms like Venmo and Cash App, but also things like PayPal, and then in China, the growth of online giving has been really kind of driven by big platforms like Tencent and WeChat and Alipay and others. And I think these commercial organizations, their driver is to meet customer expectations and preferences in order to make them stay on the platform. If those customers want to give to charity, absolutely great, meet that need. But if what they want is also to get tailored recommendations on where they should give and how they should give, these companies will want to meet that need too. And I think this then raises some really sort of quite interesting and potentially challenging questions about who gets to decide what the algorithms are that offer us this information and these choices, and how will that increasingly shape the decisions that we make about giving. There's already quite a lot that's been written about the idea of hyper nudging, using AI, which is the idea again, nudging as in the sort of behavioral economics idea that was very a la mode, 10, 15 years ago. But a version of that where it's tiny little sort of attempts to shape our behavior through how information is presented, but in a way that it's constantly being adapted and iterated to our kind of the way that we respond and the way we behave, so that it becomes ever better at kind of meeting our individual particular likes and dislikes and wants. And, I think this is something that we'll start to see in the context of philanthropy, sort of hyper-nudging philanthropy. And I think we'll also see the application of some of these systems, not just, in a commercial mass market way, but also I think to specific philanthropy advice, which is currently something that is, because of the cost involved, relatively restricted to high net worth or kind of high-end donors. I think it is possible through automation that will extend further down into the mass market, and philanthropy advice will be something that is kind of more and more a thing that the average everyday giver is able to access. Again, what that looks like and what that means and who sort of shapes that advice, I think that will be pretty important in kind of determining whether this has a positive or negative impact. And then the slightly more speculative bit that I'm going to throw in here, because I've talked about it quite a lot over the years, and I do still, I think that this is the direction of travel. And I'll outline, first of all, what I'm talking about, and then I'll say why I don't think it's ridiculous. So, if we've got to the point where increasingly people are getting advice or recommendations on where to give and how to give from AI systems and recommender algorithms, it's only really one small step to say, well, why don't we kind of cut humans out of the picture altogether? And if we've got data on where the most pressing needs are at any one given time, and then we've got data on what are the most effective organizations kind of addressing those needs, why don't we just kind of have some algorithm that essentially on a kind of continuous basis matches resources to where they're most needed, and and people can just kind of let that run and be happy that it's it's a rational and effective way of matching, and kind of more rational and effective than a human being would be. And the reason why, even though that sounds a bit science fiction-y and mad, I mean, first of all, I would say I'm not necessarily saying I think that's a good idea. I'm just saying I think it is something that might well happen. I guess a couple of reasons are, well, firstly, there's a historical context point, which is there's a very, very long history of people wanting to impose more rationality on philanthropy or on charity, and to kind of get beyond the fact that it is emotive or subjective or driven by the heart, and make it more objective and rational and driven by the head. And I think in the context of that long tradition, the idea that people would want to harness this new technology to make philanthropy hyper-rational, I don't think is actually too out there at all. The other point, I think, is that at the moment maybe it feels weird because we're still in the early stages of getting accustomed to the idea of reliance on algorithmic recommendations and on artificial intelligence systems. But again, I think that consumer expectation and experience is going to change very quickly over the next few years. So in a few years' time, it won't seem at all weird to any of us. And then I guess the other point is that we might not be very far off the point where there are new types of economic transactions and contexts in which the only way to harness some of that money for philanthropy might be to automate it. And I'm thinking here of things like the potential for what's called a machine-to-machine economy. So another idea that's been around for a couple of years and is sort of tied into everything that's going on in emerging tech and has some crossover with AI is the idea of the Internet of Things. So this is where you have sort of smart objects, so objects that have embedded sensors and also have processors and are able to kind of sense and then respond to their surroundings. And this might be, a smart fridge that is able to tell when you're out of milk and then just kind of automatically orders more for you. Or it could be, much more complicated things, and it goes up to things like sort of autonomous vehicles. But, one of the things that's sort of speculated about this is that increasingly, as that network develops and that Internet of Things develops, it will make sense for smart objects to be able to kind of conduct their own economic transactions with each other, right, without people having to kind of oversee all of that. And so you will get what is called a sort of machine-to-machine economy. And if that does happen, it will be very different to most sort of normal transactional economies, in that it will probably be a very, very high volume of extremely fast, low-value transactions. And so actually, if you want to harness some of that money for philanthropy, it would be very difficult for a human being to kind of have oversight of, any one of those transactions. So actually what you would need to do is apply some sort of algorithm that would be able to express, preferences that you had set out up front, and do that in a sort of highly automated way. So again, I think that's one reason why the idea of philgorithms, as I've called them, these sort of automated AI decision processes for that kind of automate the process of philanthropy, is worth taking seriously. But anyway, I'm going to pull us back there from the brink of speculation and kind of science fiction. And just say that in the next section, I want to come on to talk about some of the new challenges that artificial intelligence is going to pose for society and for the world, and what that means for philanthropy and kind of what role philanthropy can play in addressing some of that. So back in a moment.
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist. Genius philanthropist. Genius philanthropist. Genius philanthropist.
Okay, so yeah, we're back now. And just for the final section, as I said, I just want to talk a bit about some of the challenges of AI, the kind of the negative unintended consequences, and potentially some of the intended negative consequences, and what that means for philanthropy and civil society, and also what role civil society can potentially play in sort of addressing some of these challenges. So the first one is the challenge of that I've already mentioned around misinformation, and misinformation is kind of not. I'm thinking of this as not necessarily deliberately false information, but things that are factually wrong. And this is where the kind of ChatGPT bullshit problem comes in, which is that it's not trying to deceive you for any particular end. It's just giving you information that is wrong, and that might be problematic if we come to rely on those systems. And I think this is obviously, as I've said, a challenge for charities and for funders and for philanthropic organisations, but it will also be a challenge for the people and communities that they work with. I think there is a linked challenge that goes beyond that, which is disinformation, which is where you are actively providing fake information for a particular purpose in order to, undermine somebody else's credibility, or, to destabilize an electoral process or this sort of thing. And there, I think, AI has a particular role in that, because it offers new capabilities to produce content that is sort of indistinguishable from genuine content, but that can show things happening that actually have never taken place. And this is where the problem of what I mentioned before about deepfakes comes in. And so deepfakes it's audio or video content generated by artificial intelligence that is essentially kind of indistinguishable from the real thing. And, you can use this to produce, images of prominent people, politicians or whatever, saying things that they never said. And obviously that could have a hugely kind of damaging and destabilizing effect if kind of deployed in the right way. And, the challenge, I think, around some of this technology, particularly with deepfakes, is what do charities do about it? I mean, first of all, how do they get themselves savvy enough that they know what the problem is and aren't getting kind of caught out by deepfakes themselves? I think there's another question about, whether there are ethical questions about the use of this technology. And I think there's a blurry line in some ways between, generative AI used in creative ways and, potentially problematic applications of deepfakes. And we've already seen this a little bit in the charity world. There's been a few examples, even a few years back, of charities sort of producing video content of famous people, and then applied deepfake technology to kind of show them, for instance, talking in languages that they can't talk in. There was one I remember of David Beckham where a charity had sort of used footage of him and then dubbed it using deepfake technology into sort of various different languages. So it looked like, David Beckham was able to, was sort of multilingual genius who was able to pass on this charity's message, which, with the best will in the world, I don't think David Beckham is an enormous polyglot. So that's a kind of relatively harmless application in some ways, and in some ways it seems quite a sort of clever, canny bit of fundraising or sort of non-profit awareness raising. But in the context of these wider concerns about the application of deepfakes and the erosive and corrosive impact that might have on authenticity in the online world, I think there's really kind of potential reason to be concerned about that. I suppose the big question there then is, well, first of all, if this erosion of trust and authenticity is a particular problem for civil society organisations, what do they do about it? As I say, there's an enormous role to play here for organisations that are getting involved in kind of fact-checking in the online arena and kind of using often technology to combat some of these problems of technology by pointing out how deepfakes can be spotted and this sort of thing. And I think being aware of initiatives doing that and potentially supporting them, through funding, is part of the solution. I mean, there may also be, I guess, in a weird way, an opportunity for civil society organisations in that if increasingly online information is difficult to authenticate and people's level of trust in it is reduced, actually civil society organisations might have a particularly important role, almost as sort of oracles or kind of guardians of authenticity, by being able to use the kind of hard-won authenticity and legitimacy that they've built up over years offline to sort of point out where information is false or incorrect, and to be able to verify information that is correct. The challenge, obviously, in doing that is how do they then stop, legitimacy theft if other people are able then to kind of create, false websites or false social media content or videos that purport to be that civil society organisation and then use that in order to kind of push their own agenda. I guess the other challenge with this is, how do you cut through it all without becoming part of the problem? Again, is it possible to sort of be the one that says, hang on, we need to slow down here and not necessarily just rush ahead with this application of the technology? Or do you risk looking like a Luddite there? And or can you kind of harness the technology yourself in order to show positive ways that it could be used? And is it possible to do that without perpetuating the problem? And that kind of goes, more widely, I think, to lots of questions about the adoption of technology by civil society organisations and in the world of philanthropy. Another challenge of AI, I think that's important for philanthropic funders and for civil society organisations to be aware of is bias. There's a big problem that people are increasingly aware of with what's known as algorithmic bias, which is where algorithms and algorithmic systems produce decisions or take actions that are clearly biased against certain groups in society. And the reason they do this, again, is not because they're, horrible and racist or sexist. It is because they are trained on large sets of data, and they then shape themselves on the basis of that data to meet certain kind of targets that they have been set in terms of goals. Now, if the data on which they have been trained contains historic statistical biases for things like race or gender, which it quite often does, because historically, statistically, society has been quite racist and quite sexist. The problem is that if we just use that data without correcting for some of those issues, the algorithms that we develop off the back of them not only come to reflect those biases, they actually kind of double down and entrench them and make them even worse. And the problem is exacerbated by the fact that often these algorithms then end up operating as what's known as black boxes, which is essentially, kind of, you can't really see what's going on inside them, and nobody necessarily really understands it. So the ability to kind of challenge them, or to work out where accountability lies when decisions are taken that are problematic or biased, that raises real issues. There's also, I think, an issue about inequality. The problem when any new technology is developed is that access to the technology and the ability to control it and to own it at a different level, that becomes potentially a new dimension of inequality. And given the potential impact of AI and the sort of huge impact that it could have economically and societally, I think, at a national level between countries, but also sort of regionally within countries and between different groups in society, that inequality of access could be a huge issue. And, unfortunately for charities and civil society organisations, often they are not amongst the early adopters, and they often, do have a sort of deficit in terms of skills and ability to access this. And, there's already lots of concerns about there being a digital divide that prevents charities engaging with, much more straightforward digital technology and the internet, let alone engaging with AI and the some of the tools coming out of that. So I think there is potentially a real kind of issue around access we need to be available, need to be aware of. The two other things I think are sort of slightly bigger picture issues around AI that we hear a lot about. The one that is probably more realistic and short term, and but still not something that we're immediately worrying about in the kind of coming weeks and months, is the impact that AI and automation is going to have on the future of work. And again, I think this is, as we were saying earlier, the difference in the discussions in recent years has been, it's long been the case that kind of blue collar manual work has been at risk of replacement through automation. The qualitative difference, it feels like quite a lot of traditional white collar or knowledge based jobs that were, we probably would have thought were entirely safe from automation. It turns out we might be able to automate those too, to the extent where there are, some people are offering predictions that kind of entire, sectors and industries will essentially become redundant, because we'll be able to do all of the perform all of the functions they currently perform using automation. And I guess the relevance of that for civil society and for philanthropy at the biggest picture level is, if that is true and we're shifting to a kind of post-work future, or at least one that looks radically different in terms of our notions of work and our relationship with work, well, first of all, there's an interesting question about whether this will free up a lot more capacity for people to engage in things on a voluntary basis. And actually, again, maybe there's a utopian vision that we have a sort of golden age of volunteering, and actually engagement through voluntary means becomes ever more important. I mean, I think for that to happen, other pieces need to come into place, like potentially some form of basic income, which is, a whole other question that people are grappling with at the moment. And I guess that makes the point that in order for that transition to happen in a positive way, we need to radically rethink or come up with new ideas for the economic models that we have, because the one we have at the moment, where people's societal worth as individuals is largely based on the idea of them being productive economic units or taxpayers, that doesn't necessarily work in a future where increasingly people don't have the option of working because automation has made a lot of that work redundant. So we need to think radically differently. And so actually civil society and philanthropy probably needs to put more time and effort and money into thinking through some of that kind of those radical possibilities for the future. And then the other challenge in terms of AI that's we obviously do hear stuff about, and I mentioned at the beginning, is the much more speculative sci-fi stuff. And this is where the kind of existential risk warnings and the idea that kind of superhuman AI might emerge, which will take over, and you get talk about, a sort of technological singularity, a kind of point at which technology develops and, artificial intelligence develops, so that there's kind of a point of no return where we can't go back because it overtakes us and there's no, possibility of putting the genie back in the bottle. I guess the questions around this are, well, firstly, there's a big question about whether or not we should take it seriously. There's a lot of debate about that, and it's quite relevant for philanthropy because some of that debate is playing out sort of in the world of philanthropy, because a lot of money is going into looking at sort of existential risks from AI as a result of the effective altruism movement and kind of linked long-termist thinking. So actually it's kind of inherently kind of tied into this debate. And then on the other side of that debate, increasingly, there is a kind of vocal group of people saying, actually, all of this stuff about, the risks, or the existential risk of super intelligent AI is massively overblown. And it's also being driven by a particular type of, relatively privileged white Western male who, comes from a technological background and therefore, naturally thinks that the biggest problems facing society are ones to do with the kind of technology that they've spent all of their careers working. Whereas in reality, they're saying, what's more important, at least in the short term, is the impact that AI is going to have at a much more practical level on the lives of, marginalized communities all around the world. And, what we risk in putting lots of focus and spending lots of money on the sort of existential risks of AI that may be quite sort of low probability is that there aren't resources going to the much higher probability or actually certain, near-term impacts of the technology on communities, all around the world that don't necessarily have as big a voice in some of these debates. So I think, there's a real kind of issue there. And I guess that brings us to, the final point I want to make, which is what role should philanthropy and civil society be playing, given all of these concerns about AI? Well, one is, I guess let's go with the positive one first, that there's a potential for harnessing some of the capabilities of AI and showing how that can be done in a sort of positive and responsible way. And that's where some of the AI for good stuff, when it's meaningful, is really positive and important. I think there's also the opportunity, not necessarily just through kind of demonstration and adoption, but through the development of kind of positive alternative visions of technological development to sort of show different paths that we could take, and that some of the fatalism that you hear in debates about AI, which is, people sort of acknowledging, oh yes, it is very worrying what's going to happen, but we can't stop it, can we? We need to just plow full speed ahead. Actually saying, no, we don't necessarily need to stop and not do this stuff, but there are different ways of doing it and there are choices to be made. And, actually, if we got a broader and more diverse range of voices into these debates that wasn't just, from the technology companies that are already making these products, maybe we would have a different perspective on how some of this stuff could develop. And that's where things like, I think, the solar punk movement are really interesting, because they're offering these kind of slightly more positive visions of what a technology-enabled future could be like. I think the other role is, challenging much more directly the negative impacts of AI. First and foremost is just highlighting the challenges as they play out on in terms of the people and communities that civil society organisations and funders work with. And actually, that's a really important role, because civil society organisations are often tapped into lots of sort of grassroots communities and able to speak up on their behalf, and that's a role they should really be playing when it comes to the impact of AI. And unfortunately, that is a voice that, in my experience, certainly is sorely lacking in the debates over AI and AI ethics and the development of AI longer term. At the moment is very largely government, the tech industry, and some academics talking about that. There is not a voice of civil society in that room. And, I guess there is also, I should acknowledge, in terms of the role philanthropy should play, there is a legitimate role for allowing some of the money in philanthropy to be spent on some of those kind of bigger bets or potential existential risks. And, that's where some of the money that's going towards sort of long-termism and effective altruism, maybe, the thing is, even if these things are of sort of vanishingly small possibility or probability, the potential upshots of them are dramatic and terrible. And so I'm sort of sanguine about the idea that people should be allowed to spend some money on that. I guess the challenge is that it feels disproportionate at the moment to a lot of people, because actually EA and long-termism gets a lot of money by virtue of the fact that it appeals to a certain sort of kind of rationalist tech billionaire donor, and that is totally out of step with the money that is going towards supporting things like allowing kind of more traditional grassroots civil society organisations to get a voice in debates about AI. So actually, if those things were a bit more balanced, people might not feel so angry about it. And then just, I guess, not to be sort of overly simplistic about it, what are the challenges that are preventing some of that stuff happening at the moment that we need to address? Well, one is, I think at an organisational level, we need more knowledge and awareness about AI amongst non-profits and civil society organisations. And, that means everything from developing their own knowledge base and skills around AI, although realistically, it's not about kind of bringing in-house machine learning expertise. I'm not sure that's going to happen. So I think there's going to be a lot to be said for sort of partnering with the technology industry in order to kind of have that knowledge sharing. I think there is more to be done to make sure that sort of trustee boards have the skills and knowledge that they need to make strategic decisions about artificial intelligence. And sort of linked to that is the point that I think organisations need to have a technology strategy in place, even if they're not technology organisations or don't see themselves in those terms, because increasingly all problems to some extent are technology problems. So I think, and I think not seeing AI as an IT issue is absolutely vital. It needs to be something that is seen at a strategic level by the people kind of leading organisations. I think another thing that's really important in terms of allowing civil society to play some of the roles that I've suggested it should play is that we need to find space and time for civil society organisations and grassroots organisations to be able to sort of stop for a moment and to look up and look ahead. And that's often very difficult, particularly for small, resource-poor organisations who are struggling to raise funds and to do the work that they're doing and find it very difficult to think about their own futures, let alone think about the kind of collective future of civil society or, humanity as a whole. But I think it is important to find ways of kind of providing the infrastructure to allow that to happen and also funding it properly. So I think we need, more money from the funding side of philanthropy going into creating those spaces. And then I guess the final challenge, which without wanting to leave things on too glum a note, is that, I've said about the necessity for civil society organisations to play more of a role in debates about the development of AI and the impact of AI and the ethics of AI. The challenge is being taken seriously. I think there are a lot of sort of problematic imbalances in power and knowledge when talking about these topics, potentially between civil society organisations and the tech industry and government, which goes to a sort of more fundamental problem about an imbalance of the value that is ascribed to different forms of knowledge, where if you're talking about AI and you're a sort of small civil society organisation and you're trying to talk to Facebook or, another large tech company, the difficulty is, if they know about how the technology works and they know coding and they've got developers in there, you wouldn't necessarily have that knowledge, and that is seen as kind of highly, prized, high status knowledge. But I would argue that civil society organisation, if it has knowledge of, the communities that it works with and the social issues that are part of its mission, that is equally valuable knowledge, but it is not, I think, in that context, seen as equally valuable knowledge. So I think there is a real sort of asymmetry of power. And I think that's a real challenge that we need to overcome. Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of a whirling run through some thoughts on the impact of AI on philanthropy and, the way that philanthropy may have an impact on the development of AI over coming years. Hopefully that's kind of given you some food for thought. If you want to read some more stuff on philanthropy and AI, I'll put some links in the show notes to where you can do that. If you want to read more stuff on philanthropy and tech and philanthropy just more generally, do check out the website, whyphilanthropymatters.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Rodri_H_Davis or at Philiteracy, which is more about sort of history and theory of philanthropy. If you've got ideas for people we could talk to on the podcast or topics that you'd like to see covered, do drop me an email. You can find all my contact details on the website. Other than that, just like, subscribe, tell all your friends about it, leave us a nice review on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts, and I'll see you next time. Bye!